Most people think that the property market right now is doing exactly what it should. Prices are rising, rents are strong, listings are tight, and confidence is finally beginning to return. But the data underneath is telling a completely different story. In September, investor lending didn't just rise, it surged at its fastest rate in over 8 years. And moves like that, they don't happen in stable markets. They happen when the system is moving faster than what regulators are comfortable with. And APRA has already stepped forward. They've labeled housing as a key vulnerability, not because prices are falling, but because riskier lending is accelerating. You see, high debt to income loans is surging, and according to the AFR, some banks are now approving loans that don't even pass their own serviceability tests. And the last time that this happened, APRA tightened almost immediately. And this time, they're preparing 5 separate levers that could instantly cut investor borrowing power. And they've already met with the major banks around rolling these out as early as next month. So in today's video, I'm going to be breaking down these 5 levers, what each one will do to investors on the ground, how they'll shape 2026, and if you stay until the very end, I'll also touch on how disciplined investors can position themselves to get ahead while everyone else gets squeezed out. Guys, my name's Josh, I'm from DataEdge Property, and I help everyday Australians navigate the Australian property market using data. Data that's accessible to absolutely everyone. And if you get value out of today's video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe so you can continue receiving data-driven updates just like this. And with that said, let's dive into what APRA is actually seeing behind the curtain. You see, APRA's most recent risk outlook didn't look dramatic at first glance, but buried beneath the polite language was a very clear warning. Regulators never react to what's happening today. They react to where the trend is actually heading. And right now, that trend is heading directly into the zone that triggers macro-prudential tightening. The key line that everyone missed was this one from APRA's chair, John Lonsdale, when he said that housing remains a key vulnerability, given high household debt and prices continue to rise. We are carefully monitoring these risks and ensuring that banks are prepared to implement additional macro-prudential tools where required to reinforce lending standards. That is not passive language. That is APRA signaling 2 things simultaneously. 1, that the risk profile of today's lending is rising way too quickly for their liking, and 2, that they've already lined up tools that they need for intervention. And when a regulator says that banks must be prepared to implement these additional tools, it means that the decision to tighten is no longer hypothetical. It's already moving through the system. And you can see exactly why. Investor demand is accelerating. High debt to income lending is rising, and banks are competing hard for market share in a low volume environment. And some are loosening internal standards just to get deals over the line. And this is the exact same pattern that we saw before the 2017 investor crackdown. The market feels fine, but the underlying credit behavior is quietly drifting outside what the regulators are actually comfortable with. And if you want proof that the tightening cycle has already quietly begun, then look no further than what the banks have already done. CBA and Macquarie have effectively just pulled the plug on trust lending just a few weeks ago, something that they've allowed for years, and that decision didn't come out of nowhere. You see, moves like that only happen when APRA is in the background signaling that certain types of lending are becoming too risky. Banks don't wait for the official announcement, they preempt it. And when the 2 biggest players start shutting down trust-based borrowing, it's one of the clearest early signs that the entire lending environment is shifting. At the end of the day, APRA doesn't intervene because the system is broken. They intervene to stop it from breaking. Their goal is to slow down the pockets of the market that are building risk faster than the fundamentals can absorb. And with APRA confirming that they'll provide a macro-prudential update before Christmas, this is not a distant possibility. This is just weeks away. But guys, before we jump into the 5 levers themselves, if you're serious about using data to build real wealth through property and want to join other like-minded investors, make sure you join my completely free DataEdge Property Facebook community in the description box down below. I share insights there before they ever hit YouTube. And with that said, let's unpack the tools that APRA is preparing and what each one means in real life for you as an investor. So the first lever is a cap on high debt to income lending, and this one is deceptively powerful. You see, if APRA sets a ceiling at say 6 times debt to income, banks will be forced to decline applications above that threshold, regardless of how strong the overall credit actually is. And this hits multi-property investors the hardest because every new loan pushes their total debt to income higher. What most people don't realize is that debt to income caps, they don't cap the whole market. They surgically remove the most stretched borrowers from the system. And the moment that you remove the most stretched buyers, the psychology at auctions changes completely. But that's just the first lever. The second one is even more disruptive in practice. The second lever is reinstating investor lending speed limits, and that's the exact same mechanism that APRA used back in 2017 when they capped investor loan books at just 10% of overall lending. And when this happens, banks stop thinking about can we lend and shift to who do we lend to first. Clean incomes, low risk profiles, and strong servicing get prioritized. On the other hand, thin buffers, messy expenses, and high leverage get pushed to another side. Lending doesn't stop, it just gets rationed. And rationing changes market behavior quickly because the emotional, highly geared buyers vanish almost overnight. But if you think that's impactful, wait until you hear the third lever because that removes the stretched buyers almost entirely. You see, the third mechanism that APRA is likely to use is restricting interest-only lending. Interest-only loans are incredibly powerful for investors because they boost serviceability and allow people to stretch further up the price ladder, particularly with third-tier lenders. And that's exactly why APRA clamps down on this when the market gets too hot. The moment that interest-only criteria gets tightened through pricing or stricter criteria, an entire slice of demand disappears almost immediately. Auctions become quieter, bidding becomes more rational, and the outlier results that set new suburb records almost completely vanish. The interesting part is that interest-only tightening affects confidence more than people actually expect, and that sets the stage for the next lever, which hits absolutely everyone. The fourth lever that APRA has is raising the serviceability buffer, which currently sits at 3%. And this is the quiet giant, because if APRA lift the buffer to say 3.5% or 4%, borrowing power drops instantly across every borrower and every loan in the country. As an example, a 6% interest rate which gets assessed at 9% today would be assessed at 9.5% if the buffer were to change. And that small change can wipe 6 figures of borrowing powers for multi-property investors. This is the approach that doesn't just hit stretched investors, it hits the middle of the market. And once you hit the middle of the market, sentiment changes very quickly. But APRA still has one more lever that is often overlooked, even though it is one of the cleanest ways to cool the market, especially at the entry level point. The fifth lever is raising what's called the HEM, the household expenditure measure that banks use as a minimum living cost benchmark. When the HEM rises, your borrowing power drops even if you live frugally. This lever is a broad-based suppressant. It forces banks to assume a higher baseline of spending for absolutely everyone. And what makes this tool so effective is that it quietly removes a large chunk of lower-end investor demand without creating panic or instability. You see, when they bring the HEM curve up, you bring the bottom end of the demand curve down, and the market becomes noticeably less emotional. And whilst each of these levers work differently, they all lead to the same outcome: reduced borrowing capacity, fewer marginal buyers, and far less emotional competition. And when emotion leaves the market, behavior changes, sometimes more dramatically than price itself. And this is where the shift into 2026 really begins. And guys, if you want to learn how to assess individual properties, not just the city or the market, make sure you grab my completely free property due diligence checklist in the description box down below. It shows you how to assess land quality, zoning, and tenant demand so that you don't buy the wrong asset in the right suburb. And guys, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Do you think that APRA should be tightening right now, given that we're in the middle of a rental crisis? Drop your thoughts down below. I read every single comment and endeavor to respond to as many of you as I can. With that all said, let's discuss what all of these changes mean for the market and investors heading into 2026. So historically, when APRA has tightened, it doesn't cause crashes, it causes a repricing of behavior. You see, the highly leveraged buyers, the thin buffer investors, the people relying on interest-only lending to qualify, they're the first to pull back. And when that buyer pool shrinks, a lot of the emotional heat that pushes prices up in auctions and during private negotiations disappears with it. But here's the part that most investors miss. The fundamentals don't change. Scarcity doesn't change. Family-friendly suburbs don't suddenly become oversupplied. Good school zones don't lose demand. Well-located houses, they don't fall apart. What changes is the competition. Instead of 12 bidders at an auction, you might get 4. Instead of 40 groups at an open house, you might get 15. Instead of buyers stretching to meet the ask, they negotiate harder because fewer people have the borrowing power to overpay. And this is why tightening phases are some of the best opportunities for long-term investors. It removes volatility, not value. It slows momentum, not fundamentals, and it creates a quieter, more rational environment where the disciplined investor has more leverage. With that all said, let's talk about how you can be positioning yourself today to get ahead of that shift, because investors who succeed in tightening cycles don't get lucky, they get prepared. The first thing that investors should be doing is making their borrowing profile cleaner. Before APRA tightening hits, banks are still flexible. This is the moment to tidy up spending, reduce unnecessary liabilities, increase buffers, and make sure that tax returns and documents are all in order. Because once restrictions hit, banks often go from open to reason to strict on policy, and they do that very quickly. The second move is securing pre-approvals early. A pre-approval that's issued before tightening can literally be worth more than the one issued after it. In 2017, investors with early pre-approvals were able to borrow significantly more than those who waited. Capacity isn't just a number, it's timing. The third move is focusing on asset quality. In APRA tightening cycles, quality doesn't fall, volatility does. And that means targeting suburbs with structural scarcity, strong incomes, clean demographic profiles, genuine owner-occupied demand, and low future supply. Because these are the areas that hold value no matter how strict the lending landscape becomes. Finally, investors should protect liquidity. Even a modest buffer becomes a competitive advantage when others lose borrowing power. When markets tighten, cash doesn't just buy assets, it buys negotiation power. And this is exactly how you position yourself to thrive in a tightening cycle. But what type of investor actually does thrive? But before we jump into that, guys, if you want to see the other half of this conversation, the part about how investors can still build capacity when borrowing power gets squeezed, make sure you watch my video on how SMSFs can increase your borrowing power. It shows you exactly how your super can become your next borrowing engine when APRA finally tightens. It's linked on screen and in the description box down below if you want to check it out next. Lastly, let's touch on the type of investor who thrives when APRA tightens. So when APRA finally intervenes, it punishes those investors who have overextended and it rewards those who are disciplined. The investors who tend to thrive in these types of environments are the ones who continue borrowing when others simply can't. The ones with higher cash buffers, stable incomes, a better profit and loss statement, low consumer debt, and those with a long-term view. These investors benefit because the frenzy disappears. They face less competition, more negotiating power, and far calmer market conditions. They're not relying on hype or momentum. They're relying on fundamentals and strategy. You see, APRA cycles, they aren't chaotic. They're clarifying. They strip out the noise and leave behind a market that rewards patience, preparation, and rational decision making. But guys, here's the truth. APRA isn't trying to kill the property market. They're trying to slow the parts of it that have started running ahead of fundamentals. Investor lending is rising quickly, debt to incomes are stretching, and banks are pushing harder than their internal models recommend. And APRA knows that this is the kind of setup that becomes dangerous if left untouched. 2026 will be tighter, borrowing power will fall, and some buyers will completely disappear. But for disciplined investors, this isn't a threat, it's an advantage. It's a rare window where the noise fades, competition softens, and high quality assets become more accessible. Now guys, at the end of the day, I'm not your advisor. I'm just some guy on the internet who spends far too much time digging into the data. But everything I'm seeing points towards the next 12 to 18 months being a period of opportunity, not danger. You see, credit tightening doesn't end the game, it just changes the rules. And it's the investors who understand those rules that come out ahead. And guys, if you found this valuable, I'd really appreciate if you hit the like button and subscribe so you can continue receiving videos just like this coming out soon. I really appreciate you staying right until the very end, and I'll see you in the next one.